So moving forward in the time process for legislation, one of the really big milestones in California was in 2000, and since Roman Reed is here, I could actually have him speak to the topic, is that the very motivated family came together and got their state representative to actually put this into the ballot, got it approved so that California took the lead in putting up $1.5 million a year to try to do specialty research for spinal cord injury. Now that wasn't for stem cells, that was in the general context of spinal cord injury. So that's a positive milestone in terms of things that were happening in spinal cord research. In August 9th of 2001, that first quote that I started the whole process off with, that was part of this speech from the Bush administration. And people often confuse exactly what he said. So he said some very, very intelligent things. The comments of it actually, were interesting comments. And actually, this didn't make stem cell research in the United States illegal. But what it did do is for people who are interested in pursuing research, like myself and people at Stanford, is right up to this point, the National Institutes of Health had been saying, here are guidelines, here are ways to figure out how to get funded for stem cell research. And people would put in proposals and think about making their whole careers go down this pathway of studying stem cells. And then with this one talk, essentially what happened is all of those NIH pathways for doing stem cell research through federal funding kind of came out. So you'd have to say, if you were going to commit yourself to going down this pathway of doing research, would you really want to do it through an NIH-funded mechanism? No, it doesn't make any sense anymore. Even if it didn't necessarily make it illegal, in many ways it chilled what was going to happen with research. It also set aside something that is kind of interesting in that it allowed for funding to be given to 60 different cell lines that had existed. And that first set of cell lines that I mentioned, the ones that came up in Jamie Thompson's article in 1998, they were actually, you could potentially get funding for that type of research. Those cells were actually held by a private company, and when I get to the end of the talk, I'm going to tell you, where those basically ended up going. But if you ever hear about like approved cell lines, those were essentially the cell lines that existed when this presidential speech happened. Okay, Prop 71. So we've gone from, high to low, back up to high. So California, again, leading the way. In 2004, they came up with this legislation, which many people in the state voted for, which I think is, really pretty amazing. And part of the reason why I had to spend some time on some of those technical terms at the beginning is you kind of need those a little bit to understand what, Prop 71 says, is that even though stem cells aren't illegal, to make sure that researchers wanted to go down that topic and think about doing it, it said formally that it's legal, that there's a right to do stem cell research in California. So you would have legal protection if you wanted to do the research. The other thing that it said, remember that topic of DALI and somatic cell nuclear transfer, and trying to really get away from this topic of embryonic stem cells. We're not there yet, but if you could make them through another pathway like somatic cell nuclear transfer, that would be enormous. That would be the sort of thing that would be worth, say, putting $3 billion for a 10-year project to figure out, could California start to advance that process? And then the last thing it said was, well, it said many other things, but one of the other fundamental things that it said is the other point that I made earlier on is that it makes sure that we really drew a bright line in this concept of reproductive cloning. So we're not going to try to get into any of these really, ethical questions that don't make any sense about trying to make whole organisms. All we're going to do is we're going to get the tissues that could really change people's lives. 2009, yeah, that's the year we're living in right now. So this is another thing that is potentially a little bit misconstrued. So when the Obama administration said that stem cell research could go forward, or there was all the press about what this did, it essentially didn't set aside any specific funds for stem cells. But remember what I said was the big chill that happened early on for that Bush administration statement was, what this did is it said within 120 days we have to put back into place the NIH standards, the ethical standards, the research standards, the questions that the NIH would want, that's the National Institutes of Health, would want us to really get back to this concept that if public funding is going to protect the public interest, we have to have a mechanism for actually doing that. And that was a huge step, and I think that really did chill a lot of the thought process about how to move forward with stem cell research in the U.S.